Welcome, traveller, to the glittering and scandal-soaked heart of ancient Rome. Tonight, we step beyond marble statues and heroic legends into a world of whispered rumors, secret corridors, and candlelit intrigue. At the center of it all stands Valeria Messalina, 1748 AD, the young and controversial wife of Emperor Claudius, a woman whose name would become synonymous with excess, seduction, and political danger. Ancient writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal painted her as an empress who slipped from the imperial palace into the city's brothels in disguise, competing with courtesans and shocking Rome's elite. But was she truly the embodiment of decadence, or a convenient villain crafted by historians loyal to her enemies? In an empire built on power, image was everything, and Messalina's image burned brighter, darker, and louder than almost any other woman in Roman history. Prepare to enter a tale where politics meets passion, and truth dances dangerously close to myth. The Roman Empire that welcomed Valeria Messalina into the world around 25 CE was a realm still adjusting to the uncomfortable reality that it was no longer a republic. Barely 50 years had passed since Augustus transformed Rome from a centuries-old republic into a monarchy disguised in republican clothing, and the ruling class remained deeply ambivalent about this arrangement. Senators who traced their lineages back to the heroes of the republic now competed for imperial favor rather than electoral victories. Power had migrated from the Forum to the Palatine Hill, from public debate to private audiences, from the will of the people to the whims of a single family. This was the world Messalina entered, a world where bloodlines had become currency, where proximity to the emperor meant everything, and where women of the right families could wield influence that their ancestors would have found unimaginable. Messalina was born into precisely the kind of family that mattered in this new imperial order. Her full name, Valeria Messalina, announced her credentials immediately to anyone familiar with Roman aristocracy. The Valerii were among the oldest patrician clans in Rome, claiming descent from companions of Romulus himself, and her father, Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus, came from the distinguished Messala branch of this ancient house. But it was her mother's side that truly marked her for greatness, or at least for proximity to greatness. Domitia Lepida the Younger was the daughter of Antonia Major, who was herself the daughter of Mark Antony, and Octavia, sister of Augustus. This meant that young Messalina was the great-great-granddaughter of Augustus's sister, placing her firmly within the extended imperial family. In an age when the succession remained dangerously unclear and multiple branches of the dynasty competed for position, this bloodline was both an asset and a target. Her childhood remains largely obscure to us, as the ancient sources cared little about the early years of women who had not yet become notorious. Her father died while she was young, and she was raised primarily by her mother, a woman who would later appear in the historical record as both an ally and an adversary during Messalina's final hours. What we can reconstruct suggests a typical upbringing for a girl of her class: education in literature, music, and household management, training in the social graces expected of an aristocratic Roman woman, and above all, preparation for the marriage that would define her adult life. For women of Messalina's rank, marriage was never a personal matter. It was a strategic alliance between families, a consolidation of political interests, a means of producing legitimate heirs who would carry forward both bloodlines and ambitions. The man chosen for Messalina, or more accurately, the man for whom Messalina was chosen, was her distant cousin Tiberius Claudius Nero Germanicus, known to history simply as Claudius. The match was extraordinary for several reasons, not least because Claudius was approximately 30 years older than his teenage bride. Born in 10 BCE in Lugdunum, modern Lyon, Claudius had spent most of his 50 years being dismissed and mocked by his own family. He walked with a limp, his head shook, he stuttered when speaking, and he drooled when excited. His own mother, the formidable Antonia Minor, reportedly called him a monster of a man, not finished by nature but only begun, and used him as a standard of stupidity. saying of someone she considered foolish that they were a bigger fool than my son Claudius. The Emperor Tiberius refused to grant him public offices, and Caligula kept him around primarily as an object of cruel amusement, forcing him to pay enormous sums for the privilege of holding magistracies and pelting him with food at banquets. Yet Claudius possessed something that transcended these humiliations: blood. He was the son of the beloved general Nero Claudius Drusus, the brother of the revered Germanicus, the nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, and the uncle of the Emperor Caligula. When Caligula was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard in January 41 CE, the soldiers found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, reportedly trembling with fear. Rather than killing him, they proclaimed him emperor. The Senate, presented with a fait accompli and lacking any viable alternative, ratified the choice. The stammering, twitching, supposedly foolish Claudius was now master of the Roman world, and his young wife, Messalina, was Empress. She was approximately 15 or 16 years old. The title of Empress Augusta in Latin carried no formal constitutional powers. Rome maintained the fiction that it remained a republic, with the emperor merely the first citizen who happened to hold various traditional offices simultaneously. There was no legal role for an emperor's wife, no defined duties, no official authority. Yet in practice, the women of the imperial household wielded enormous informal power. Augustus's wife, Livia, had been so influential that rumors swirled for generations about her involvement in the deaths of various imperial heirs who stood between her son, Tiberius, and the throne. Caligula's sisters had been honored on coins and included in official oaths, at least until their brother turned on them. The imperial women managed vast personal fortunes, controlled networks of slaves and freedmen, received petitions and granted favors, and influenced appointments and policies through their access to the emperor's private chambers and private moments. Messalina stepped into this role with what appears to have been remarkable confidence for someone so young. Within months of Claudius's accession, she had borne him a daughter, Claudia Octavia, and the following year, in early 41 CE, she produced a son, Tiberius Claudius Germanicus, called Britannicus after his father's conquest of Britain. The birth of a male heir transformed Messalina's position entirely. She was no longer merely the emperor's wife, but the mother of his successor, the woman who had given Claudius what his previous marriages had failed to provide, a son to continue his line. Roman tradition venerated mothers of sons, and the mother of a future emperor occupied a uniquely powerful position. She could act in her son's interests, which conveniently aligned with her own, and any attack on her became an attack on the imperial succession itself. The young empress began exercising this power almost immediately. The ancient sources describe her involvement in a series of prosecutions and property seizures during the early years of Claudius's reign, though they attribute her motives entirely to greed, lust, and spite rather than political calculation. The gardens of Lucullus, one of the most magnificent estates in Rome, originally created by the legendary general and gourmand Lucullus, caught her eye. Their owner, Valerius Asiaticus, was a wealthy senator and former consul who had allegedly played some role in Caligula's assassination. Messalina arranged for his prosecution on charges of adultery, corruption, and conspiracy. And despite a defense so moving that it reportedly brought tears to Claudius's eyes, Asiaticus was condemned and allowed to commit suicide. The gardens became Messalina's property, the same gardens where, just a few years later, she herself would meet her end. Modern historians debate how much initiative Messalina actually exercised in these affairs and how much she served as a convenient scapegoat for decisions made by Claudius and his powerful freedmen advisors. The emperor relied heavily on his former slaves, particularly Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, who had risen to positions of extraordinary influence, managing the imperial bureaucracy. These freedmen had their own interests and enemies, and attributing unpopular decisions to the empress's malice served everyone's purposes except hers. Yet the consistency with which the sources describe Messalina's active involvement suggests that she was more than a passive figurehead. She appears to have understood, even at her young age, that power in Claudius's Rome flowed to those who seized it, and that the emperor's evident affection for her and their children gave her leverage that few others possessed. Her influence extended into religious and ceremonial spheres as well. In 43 CE, when Claudius departed for Britain to personally oversee the final stages of the conquest that would add a new province to the empire, Messalina remained in Rome with their children. Upon his return, she was granted the extraordinary honor of riding in a ceremonial chariot during his triumphal procession, a distinction previously reserved for Livia, the wife of Augustus himself. The Senate voted her the title of Augusta, though she apparently declined it, perhaps recognizing that too much visible honor might provoke resentment. She was granted the privilege of sitting in the front seats at public spectacles, the right to use a ceremonial carriage called a carpentum, and various other marks of status that elevated her above all other women in Rome. The court that surrounded Messalina during these years was a hothouse of ambition, intrigue, and danger. Senators competed for her favor, knowing that a word from the Empress could advance or destroy a career. Foreign embassies sought audiences with her as well as with Claudius. Freedmen and slaves jockeyed for position within her household, which had become a power center in its own right. She was not yet 20 years old, yet she moved through this world with the assurance of someone who had known nothing else, who had been raised to understand that her blood entitled her to command, and her position enabled her to act. The marble corridors of the Palatine Palace, the dinner parties where the fate of provinces was decided between courses, the whispered conversations and secret messages that constituted Roman politics, all of this was Messalina's natural environment. Whether she was already engaged in the romantic intrigues that would later define her reputation remains impossible to determine. The ancient sources, writing after her death and disgrace, projected her eventual infamy backward onto these early years, describing affairs and indiscretions that may or may not have occurred. What seems certain is that by the mid-40 SCE, Valeria Messalina had established herself as one of the most powerful people in Rome, a young woman whose influence rivaled that of the emperor's most trusted advisors and whose ambitions showed no sign of being satisfied with what she had already achieved. She had risen from noble birth to imperial consort to mother of the heir in less than a decade. The question that would determine her fate, and that continues to fascinate historians, was what she intended to do with that power, and whether Rome would allow her to keep it. Late at night, when respectable Roman matrons slept in their homes, the Empress Messalina supposedly donned a blonde wig, slipped out of the imperial palace, and made her way through the darkened streets to a common brothel near the theatre of Marcellus. There, under the working name Lyciska, the she-wolf, she took her place in a cell with a gilded doorpost, offered her breasts to customers for a few copper coins, and labored through the night, accepting all comers. Only when the brothel keeper dismissed his girls at dawn did she reluctantly depart, returning to the Palatine exhausted by men but not yet satisfied, her face still grimy with lamp smoke and her body carrying the smell of the establishment back to the emperor's bed. This image, seared into Western cultural memory for nearly 2,000 years, comes from a single source, the satirist Juvenal, writing his sixth satire approximately 60 years after Messalina's death. It is almost certainly fiction, yet it became the defining story of her life. Understanding what Messalina actually did as opposed to what Roman writers claimed she did requires first understanding who those writers were and why they wrote what they wrote. The three principal ancient sources for her life are Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, with Juvenal providing the most salacious details despite writing poetry rather than history. Each of these men wrote decades after her death. None had personal knowledge of her, and all operated within a literary and political tradition that had specific uses for stories about wicked women. Their accounts cannot be dismissed entirely, but neither can they be accepted at face value. They are evidence, but evidence that must be interrogated as carefully as a hostile witness in a trial. Tacitus, generally considered the most reliable of the ancient historians, composed his annals around 115 to 120 CE, roughly 70 years after Messalina's execution. He was a senator and former consul, a man deeply invested in the traditions of the Roman aristocracy, and his history reflects both genuine research he consulted earlier sources and senatorial records, and genuine bias. Tacitus wrote to condemn tyranny, to mourn the lost freedom of the Republic, and to illustrate the corruption that absolute power bred in rulers and their families. He needed villains, and Messalina served that purpose admirably. Yet even Tacitus sometimes hedges, noting when stories seemed improbable or when his sources conflicted. His account of Messalina's final marriage to Gaius Silius, for instance, includes the remarkable admission that he knows his readers will find the tale incredible, a hint that he himself had doubts about some of what he reported. Suetonius, writing his Lives of the Caesars around the same period, took a different approach. His biographies were organized by topic rather than chronology, with sections devoted to each emperor's virtues, vices, appearance, habits, and death. This structure encouraged the accumulation of anecdotes, scandalous stories, and memorable details regardless of their reliability, is less than #0. 4 is greater than Suetonius had access to imperial archives during his tenure as secretary to the Emperor Hadrian, but he was more interested in entertaining his readers than in rigorous historical analysis. His portrait of Claudius emphasizes the emperor's weakness and gullibility, making Messalina's alleged dominance over him seem more plausible. Whether these characterizations reflect reality or literary convention is impossible to determine from the sources themselves. Juvenal stands apart from the historians because he never claimed to be writing history at all. His 6th satire, the source of the brothel story, is a savage attack on Roman women in general, arguing that marriage is foolish because all wives are inevitably unfaithful, extravagant, domineering, or otherwise intolerable. Messalina appears as the ultimate example of female lust, proof that even the highest-born women are slaves to their appetites. The satire is deliberately exaggerated, packed with rhetorical flourishes and impossible scenarios, and Juvenal's contemporaries would have understood it as such. Yet, over the centuries, readers stripped the story of its satirical context and treated it as historical fact. The she-wolf Empress became real in the popular imagination because the image was simply too vivid, too memorable, to resist. The specific accusations against Messalina follow a pattern familiar from Roman attacks on other powerful women. She is described as insatiably lustful, taking lovers from every social class: senators, actors, slaves, foreigners. She is depicted as greedy, acquiring property through judicial murder and extortion. She is portrayed as cruel, destroying anyone who crossed her or whom she simply disliked. These same accusations appear in Roman accounts of Livia, Agrippina the Elder, Agrippina the Younger, Julia, the daughter of Augustus, and virtually every other imperial woman who achieved any degree of prominence. The repetition suggests not that all these women were uniquely depraved, but that Roman writers had a limited vocabulary for criticizing female power. Moral transgression was the default accusation because it struck at the heart of what Roman women were supposed to be: chaste guardians of the household and producers of legitimate heirs. A woman who violated these norms threatened not just her own family but the entire social order. Modern scholars have given a name to this phenomenon: the bad Empress tradition. Roman historiography consistently portrayed imperial women as either virtuous paragons of traditional femininity, like Claudius's mother Antonia, praised for her loyalty to her dead husband's memory, or as monsters of vice whose appetites knew no bounds. There was little room for complexity, for women who were politically active without being morally corrupt, for ambition that was not rooted in feminine weakness. This binary reflected deep Roman anxieties about the role of women in the new imperial system. The Republic had kept women firmly in the domestic sphere, with no formal role in politics and only indirect influence through their male relatives. The empire, by concentrating power in a single household, inevitably gave the women of that household access to power that traditional ideology could not accommodate. Condemning these women as morally improper was a way of denying the legitimacy of their influence. of insisting that they had stepped outside their proper place and must therefore be corrupt. The term nymphomania, that appears in virtually every modern discussion of Messalina, is itself revealing. The word did not exist in Latin. It was coined in the 18th century by physicians attempting to medicalize female desire and independence, transforming what had previously been understood as sin or moral failure into a disease requiring treatment. Applying this clinical term to Messalina imports assumptions that would have been foreign to ancient Romans. They did not think of her alleged behavior as a psychiatric condition, but as a moral choice, evidence of bad character rather than bad health. When modern writers call Messalina a nymphomaniac, they are imposing a pseudo-scientific framework that simultaneously condemns her and excuses her, suggesting that she could not help herself while still portraying her personal behavior as abnormal. This framing has made it easier to accept the ancient accusations as fact, since modern readers can understand them through a familiar diagnostic category rather than recognizing them as political propaganda. Some of the accusations against Messalina may contain kernels of truth. Ancient sources agree that she took the actor Mnester as a lover, supposedly obtaining an order from Claudius, commanding him to obey her in all things, which she then interpreted as including personal compliance. The story is suspicious in its details but not implausible in outline. Affairs between aristocratic women and performers were common enough in Rome to be a cliché. The sources also agree that she pursued various vendettas against real and imagined rivals, using her influence with Claudius to bring prosecutions on fabricated charges. The execution of Julia Livilla, daughter of Germanicus and thus a potential rival for influence, and the forced suicide of Appius Silanus, whom Messalina allegedly desired and who rejected her advances. Both appear in multiple sources and may reflect genuine events, even if the motivations ascribed to Messalina are tendentious. What seems far less credible is the portrait of absolute depravity, of an empress so consumed by lust that she would risk everything by disguising herself and visiting a common house of pleasure. Even setting aside the practical difficulties, the Palatine Palace was full of guards, attendants, and informants, making secret nocturnal excursions extraordinarily risky. The story makes no psychological sense. Messalina was a woman of immense power who could have summoned any man in Rome to her bed with far less effort and danger than sneaking through the streets in disguise. The brothel story serves rhetorical purposes rather than historical ones. It demonstrates the depths to which unchecked female behavior can descend. It punishes her posthumously by associating her with the lowest class of Roman women, and it provides a memorable image that captures everything Romans feared about powerful women in a single unforgettable scene. The question of what Messalina actually did during her years as empress may be ultimately unanswerable. The sources are too hostile, too far removed in time, and too embedded in literary conventions to permit confident reconstruction. What we can say is that she was politically active, that she accumulated enemies, and that those enemies destroyed her and then wrote her history. The woman who emerges from the ancient sources is less a person than a symbol, a cautionary tale dressed in imperial purple. Every age has found in her what it expected to find. Renaissance artists discovered titillation. Victorian moralists found vindication of female domesticity. 20th century psychologists identified a case study, and contemporary historians recognize propaganda. Perhaps the most telling detail in all the ancient accounts comes from Pliny the Elder, who reports in his Natural History that Messalina once challenged a notorious courtesan to a competition to see who could bed more men in a single night. Messalina allegedly won, completing 25 encounters to the professional's defeat. Pliny offers this story not in a section about imperial scandal, but in a discussion of human endurance and remarkable physical feats, alongside accounts of soldiers who survived terrible wounds and athletes who performed incredible deeds. He treats it as a simple fact, noteworthy but not particularly shameful, as if recording an unusual athletic achievement. The story is almost certainly invented, but Pliny's matter-of-fact presentation reveals how thoroughly Messalina's reputation had been established within a generation of her death. She had become not a complex historical figure, but a byword, a reference point, a type. The real woman, whatever she was, had already disappeared beneath the legend that Roman writers had created and that subsequent centuries would eagerly perpetuate. In the autumn of 48 CE, while Emperor Claudius was away at the port city of Ostia, overseeing grain supplies for Rome, his wife Valeria Messalina made a decision so audacious that ancient historians struggled to explain it as anything other than madness. She married another man. Not in secret, not in some symbolic ceremony hidden from prying eyes, but in a formal Roman wedding complete with witnesses, sacrifices, and a signed marriage contract. The groom was Gaius Silius, widely considered the most handsome man in Rome, a consul designate from an impeccable family. The bride was still, legally and publicly, the wife of the most powerful man in the world. This act has puzzled historians for 2 millennia. Was it a coup attempt? A desperate bid for power before Claudius could dispose of her? Or simply the reckless culmination of a woman who believed herself untouchable? The ancient sources, predictably hostile to Messalina, offer little clarity. Tacitus, writing decades later in his annals, confessed that he knew the events would seem fabulous to his readers, that it would strain credulity to believe anyone could have felt so secure in a city full of informants and spies. Yet he insisted the story was true, vouched for by the oldest senators of his day who had witnessed the aftermath firsthand. The marriage to Silius was almost certainly more than romantic folly. Silius came from a family with dangerous connections. His father had been executed under Tiberius for conspiracy, and he himself possessed the youth, popularity, and political credentials that Claudius conspicuously lacked. Some modern historians have interpreted the union as a calculated political move, with Claudius aging, frequently ill, and widely mocked for his physical disabilities and perceived weakness. Messalina may have been positioning Silius as a potential replacement, securing her own future and that of her children, particularly her son Britannicus, who stood to inherit the empire. By attaching herself to a vigorous younger man with consular authority, she could potentially control the transition of power. Others have suggested that Silius himself was the driving force, using his relationship with the Empress to position himself for the purple. Whatever the true motivations, the conspiracy, if it can be called that, unraveled with astonishing speed. The freedman Narcissus, one of Claudius's most trusted advisors and a man who had long been wary of Messalina's influence, learned of the marriage and recognized immediately that he faced a choice between destroying the Empress or being destroyed by her. He chose to act. Rather than inform Claudius directly, knowing the emperor's notorious weakness for his wife and his tendency toward indecision, Narcissus employed a clever stratagem. He arranged for 2 of the emperor's favorite concubines to break the news, calculating that Claudius would be more likely to believe women from his own household than scheming freedmen with obvious political interests. The plan worked. Claudius, informed at Ostia that his wife had publicly married another man while he was away, was reportedly thrown into a state of confused terror. According to Tacitus, he kept asking whether he was still emperor, whether Silius had seized power. His reaction reveals just how precarious imperial authority could feel, how even the ruler of the known world could be gripped by paranoid uncertainty. Narcissus pressed his advantage, accompanying Claudius back to Rome and ensuring that the emperor remained surrounded by advisors hostile to Messalina. During the journey, he allegedly took the extraordinary step of assuming command of the Praetorian Guard for the day, fearing that if Claudius saw his wife in person, his resolve would crumble. Messalina, for her part, seems to have grasped too late the magnitude of her miscalculation. Ancient sources describe her rushing toward Claudius as he approached Rome, accompanied by her children, Britannicus and Octavia, hoping that the sight of his offspring might soften his heart. Narcissus intercepted her, ensuring the meeting never occurred. She was sent to the gardens of Lucullus, the magnificent estate she had acquired through the judicial murder of its previous owner, a detail that Tacitus notes with grim irony, suggesting that she would meet her end in a place obtained through her own cruelty. What followed was less a trial than a purge. Silius was arrested and executed along with numerous alleged co-conspirators, including senators, knights, and various figures from Roman high society. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, Silius reportedly requested only a swift death, a request that was granted. Others were not so stoic, and the executions continued for days as Narcissus and his allies eliminated anyone who might pose a threat or possess inconvenient knowledge. Messalina herself remained in the gardens, waiting. Tacitus provides a haunting portrait of her final hours. She composed a petition to Claudius, alternating between hope and despair, occasionally flashing the old arrogance that had defined her years of power. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, sat with her, a woman who had reportedly been estranged from her daughter during her years of glory, but who now came to offer what comfort she could. According to Tacitus, Lepida urged her daughter to take her own life before the executioners arrived, to meet death with dignity rather than allow her enemies the satisfaction of killing her. "Your life is over," she is said to have told her. "All that remains is to make a decent end." Messalina could not bring herself to do it. When a tribune arrived with soldiers, she took a blade but could not complete the act, and the tribune ran her through. She was perhaps 23 years old, though ancient sources vary on her exact birth date. She had been empress for less than a decade, married to Claudius since she was approximately 14. Claudius, meanwhile, was at dinner when news of her death arrived. The sources record that he displayed no visible emotion, calling neither for wine in celebration nor expressing grief, and that in the days following, he behaved as though nothing unusual had occurred. Some historians interpret this as evidence of his relief, others as the numbed response of a man manipulated by his freedmen into destroying his own wife, and still others as simple political calculation. Any display of grief might suggest that Messalina had been wrongly killed, which would implicate those who had orchestrated her downfall. The Senate ordered her name removed from all public places and her statues destroyed, the formal erasure known as damnatio memoriae that Romans reserved for their most despised figures. The imperial children, Britannicus and Octavia, survived their mother's disgrace, but bore its consequences for the rest of their shortened lives. Britannicus, the natural heir to Claudius, found himself increasingly marginalized after his father's remarriage to Agrippina the Younger, who brought her own son, the future Emperor Nero, into the household. When Claudius died in 54 CE, likely poisoned by Agrippina, though this remains disputed, it was Nero, not Britannicus, who became emperor. Britannicus died the following year at a banquet, almost certainly poisoned on Nero's orders, a fate that some ancient writers saw as the final consequence of his mother's crimes catching up with her bloodline. Octavia fared little better. Married to Nero as a teenager, she was eventually divorced, exiled, and executed on false charges of adultery, her head sent to Nero's mistress Poppaea as a trophy. The children of the scandalous empress were erased from history almost as thoroughly as their mother, their promising futures sacrificed to the endless machinations of imperial succession. Yet Messalina herself proved impossible to forget. Her story was simply too sensational, too rich with the elements that have always fascinated audiences: intimacy, power, betrayal, and spectacular downfall. The Roman historians who wrote about her, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, shaped her into an archetype of feminine excess and corruption, a warning about what happened when women were allowed too close to power. Juvenal, the savage satirist, immortalized her in his sixth satire as the Empress who supposedly snuck out of the palace at night to work in a brothel under the name Lysiska, remaining until dawn, exhausted by men but not yet satisfied. Whether this story contains any grain of truth or represents pure invention designed to titillate and moralize, it became the dominant image of Messalina for centuries. The Renaissance rediscovered her with enthusiasm. Artists painted her in various states of undress, often in brothel settings drawn directly from Juvenal. Writers used her as a symbol of unchecked lust and imperial decadence. By the 18th and 19th centuries, she had become a staple of European opera and theatre, her story adapted for stages across the continent. The name Messalina itself became a common noun, appearing in dictionaries as a synonym for a promiscuous woman, a fate shared by few historical figures, transforming a specific Roman empress into a general category of female transgression. Modern scholarship has attempted to recover a more nuanced picture of the historical Messalina from beneath the layers of ancient propaganda and subsequent embellishment. Feminist historians have noted how consistently Roman writers used accusations of moral excess to discredit politically active women, suggesting that much of what we think we know about Messalina may tell us more about Roman anxieties regarding female power than about the empress herself. The marriage to Silius, whatever its true nature, was unquestionably a political act with political consequences, yet the ancient sources seemed almost incapable of describing it in purely political terms. It had to be explained as the culmination of insatiable lust, the inevitable endpoint of a woman whose appetites knew no bounds. This framing served multiple purposes. It justified her execution, it reinforced traditional gender norms, and it provided subsequent emperors and their historians with a convenient cautionary tale. Contemporary novels, films, and television series continue to find Messalina irresistible. The BBC's Claudius, based on Robert Graves's novels, presented her as a cunning and dangerous figure, played with memorable intensity by Sheila White. Subsequent productions have ranged from serious historical drama to exploitation cinema, each generation reinterpreting her according to its own preoccupations and tastes. She appears in video games set in ancient Rome, in historical fiction, in academic conferences and popular podcasts. 2,000 years after her death in the gardens of Lucullus, Valeria Messalina remains famous or infamous, her name still carrying the charge that Roman writers first gave it. And so, as the marble halls of Rome fade into shadow, the legend of Valeria Messalina c. 1748 AD lingers like perfume in a forbidden chamber, half history, half scandal, entirely unforgettable. Wife of Emperor Claudius, whispered rival of senators, and heroine of endless gossip, she became less a woman and more a myth spun by her enemies and immortalized by time. Was she truly the empress who turned Rome into a brothel, or the ultimate victim of political propaganda? The truth sleeps somewhere between intrigue and exaggeration, but her name still echoes louder than many emperors who wore the crown longer. As the Roman satirist Juvenal wrote of her infamous nights, when the emperor slept, she preferred the brothel to the palace. Whether villain, victim, or vivid rumor, Messalina reminds us that history is not only carved in stone, it is also whispered in the dark. And with that, we close the curtains on Rome's most notorious empress, where power, passion, and politics forever entwined. Farewell.